throw you away now. So I put it down and figured we'd do something else. I did want to make sure I got in live anyways, and I wanted to make sure that I was doing a couple more later in the day lives as well, just because we want to make sure that we have, different time frames for people. This is an educational live. It is absolutely about education and about learning new things. It's less of a discussion panel live. So when we're looking at certain things throughout history, we have a whole lot of information that's really coming out as we move through the world right now. And so it's important to recognize that information and important to recognize what that information actually tells us. Hey, beautiful. Unfortunately, most of the time when we're looking at this information, we're not getting like information that can be interpreted well sometimes, or information that can be understood well. There's a lot of gatekeeping within academia. And a lot of that gatekeeping within academia makes it so hard for people to really see what's going on. And so I want to make sure that when new things are coming out and stuff like that, that we're seeing what's going on with them, right? What they mean, what it says. This picture is Denny, and Denny is half Neanderthal and half Denisovian. Denny was 13 years old when she, biological sex female, died 90,000 years ago. She had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovian father. It's been a hot minute since we talked about Denisovian, so I had to think for a second, but a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovian father. We only have like a 2-inch piece of Denny's thigh bone. So there is some new things out of Max Planck Institute. Max Planck Institute is really like the pinnacle when it comes to understanding DNA and science these days, right? And there is a new testing ability that's coming out of Max Planck Institute, which will actually take the genetics of a genome, of a human's genome, or well, in this case, this is human, it's just not a sapien genome, and take those genetics and tell you what that genetic looks like. So when we are looking at Denny here, what we're seeing is the results of a full genomic testing that was done again out of the Max Planck Institute. And then them using that newer ability to actually take that full genome testing and kind of compile what a person would look like out of that full genomic testing. We have a lot of new information coming out with this age of information really going on with DNA and stuff like that. Like if you have not seen recently in the news, they have figured out how to actually pull DNA out of the air. So like they can pull DNA out of the air down at the beach or like in the middle of this Times Square kind of shit. They've also figured out how to pull DNA out of the ground. Like there was an article that went across a few months ago that talked about the newest DNA that we have. The oldest DNA that we have is 2 million years old. And what they did was a core sample of a Siberian tundra. And in that core sample of the Siberian tundra, they were able to pull DNA of what the biome looked like 2 million years ago on the Siberian tundra. Hi, Tees. And so with that, we're seeing that all of these new developments with DNA really are giving us a greater understanding of what is going on prior to us, what is going on when we start, what is going on throughout our history, what is going on currently. So the Max Planck Institute is actually where the person who developed polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, came from. He was working out of the Max Planck Institute when he developed it. And last year, we saw him win the Nobel Peace Prize in medicine for his invention of polymerase chain reaction. And polymerase chain reaction takes DNA and multiplies it. Craig, you're kind of rude. Like, you could check that anytime now, try being a little bit. But in that ability, what it does is it takes a singular strand of DNA and multiplies it into millions. So before, we couldn't really test a lot of ancient DNA because it was very hard to get DNA out of somebody, especially ancient ancient beings. And with that, if we did, we might get no more than one strand of DNA and destroy the bone to get that strand of DNA. And then you have to destroy the DNA itself to test it, and one strand doesn't test. So polymerase chain reaction took that one strand and made it into millions of strands. So now we have the ability to test ancient DNA. This gives us so much information now that we are able to almost map out well, we're absolutely able to map out environments, but we're almost able to map out the environment of us and as we grew and as we move. Hello, Luna. And in that mapping out and in that understanding, it's really broadening our understanding of our early selves and of the other groups that were around us, and the world itself, how the world is changing, how we've changed the world, the effects, all of those kind of things. And so personally, I find this stuff the most fascinating. Personally, to me, this is where I really am like, wow. I've always been somebody who wanted to know the most I possibly could about my ancestors. I was taught from a very young age that it was important to know all of my ancestors, where all of my ancestors came from, and what all of their experiences were, so that I could understand what people had gone through and so that I could understand my ancestors. And I was raised with ancestry worship as well. So that was a really big part of that. So for me, this has always been extremely, extremely, extremely interesting and extremely important. So Homo florensis is in the Philippines, and it's in an island. Actually, it's in an island in Indonesia. It's not the Philippines. The one in the Philippines is Luzon Zensis. Yeah, Luzon Zensis is the one in the Philippines. Homo erectus is in Indonesia. So when we're looking at what the world looks like, 300,000 years ago when we start to come onto the scene, and what the world looks like both before and after that, it's important to note that a lot of the things that we think are very much just sapien aren't really just sapien. We've recently found out that 335,000 years ago to 325 or to 225,000 years ago, Homo naledi was burying their dead, and Homo naledi was carving on cave walls to kind of mark their burial sites, as well as returning to burial sites to commune with their ancestors. So, and as well as using portable fire in the form of some form of a torch of some kind, because they're using that portable fire to navigate through extremely long, extremely narrow tunnels. This is just another indication of how science and medicine are such an innate and indigenous part of us that it just kind of doubles down on all that information. And so today we're really going to start with science and medicine being indigenous. Indigeneity is currently something that is governed and recognized by the UN. Decides who is and who isn't indigenous. There are people who fit the UN indigeneity list who are not recognized as indigenous by the UN, people struggling to be recognized as indigenous by the UN. Indigenous itself is about belonging to a space. So people want to state, in fact, I read an article by an actual archaeologist recently who used the word colonization when colonization was the incorrect word. So let me go over a couple of vocabulary terms first. Migration is moving through an area where nobody else is, or where you commonly move through. So like if you have a migration path that you move in every year, or if you are moving into a new area and people aren't there. Immigration is moving from one area to another area that is already populated by human beings, and becoming a part of the government or the society or the culture that is there. And colonization is going into an area that is not your area, that is already peopled, and instilling your government from a different area over the people in that area. So as people are moving out of Africa and across the globe, they are moving into areas that are sometimes peopled by other people, whether they're Denisovian, whether they're Neanderthal, whether they're Florensis. They are moving into areas sometimes, not always, that are peopled by people that are already there. This is a migration pattern. We are not talking about moving in and taking over space and dominating space or controlling space or placing Homo sapien idea of government over the idea of government of those spaces. Most of the times, what we're seeing is people are actually moving into groups of people that are there. So, tribe means a group based on lineage. So, whether it's matriarchal or patriarchal lineage, what it is based on is who you are the child of. A good example is you have a woman who has 10 daughters. Her and her 10 daughters start a group. The 10 daughters each marry a male from outside groups, but the group that they belong to bases itself on the lineage. If you are your mother's daughter, then you're a member of that group. If you're a mother's son, you're a member of that group. Whereas a band is based on groups of several different lineages. So you might have Homo denisovan and Homo sapien and Homo neanderthal all living together in the same band. Bands are what we find a lot of throughout early human history. We see that it looks like currently even Homo erectus kind of comes out of bands. It looks like we see Homo habilis, Paranthropus boisei, and a couple of other groups all kind of living in the same bands when Homo erectus starts. Homo erectus themselves seems to have been made of several different subspecies. There's about 14 different subspecies that we can apply to Homo erectus, and we apply them to Homo erectus because they all seem to be intermixing really easily. Or we apply them as subspecies because they all seem to be intermixing really easily. And we see that many times they lived in bands of many different subspecies in the same camp. We see the same happens when we're looking at the early movement of Homo sapien. We know that Homo sapien and Homo neanderthal live in two separate caves that are about a 5-minute walk from each other in the Levant area from 150,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago. We also see that within Denisova cave, the cave that Denny comes from, that Homo sapien, Homo neanderthal, and Homo denisovian are all living together within that cave. So when we're seeing these things, what we're seeing is bands, groups based on non-genetic lineage who are coming together because the more people you have, the safer you are, the more you eat. The better your children are protected, the more things that you are capable of doing. It's better to have more people around you. The idea that you should only be two people raising children is really a housing market thing, anyways. Like it's really something the government did to try and create money for the housing market. So when we're looking at early groups of peoples, we are looking at indigenous groups of peoples. Now, when you're moving into an area, you tend to develop a language, an understanding of that area. Um, when you stay in an area for thousands of years, you tend to have a deeper understanding of that area that somebody new coming in isn't going to have. You know what plants work for medicines, you know what plants work for food, you know when the salmon run, you know where the deer trails are, you know where the wildcat is. You know these things and you develop language around it. You develop the ability to understand by a simple word. I come from the Pacific Northwest. English is absolutely not an indigenous language on any level, but here in the Pacific Northwest, we see that we have like 20 or 30 different names for the word rain, right? Or for the action of rain. We might say it's sleeting. We might say it's sheeting. We might say that it's spitting. We might say that it's drizzling. We might say that it's misting. I have literally driven through 100-foot patch up in the north, way up in the Pacific Northwest, where it went from sheeting rain to sheets of rain to this very light misty drizzle to sheets of rain again to pouring rain to a very light drizzle to a mist to sheets again. And you can see that in each one of those different descriptions, you can understand by the descriptor of the word what I'm talking about in going through different patches, right? So, when you are developing an indigenous language, this is often how this works. You develop a language that I can say a singular word, and you're going to know exactly what I mean. I'm not going to have to say, it was raining. Well, how hard was it raining? Oh, it was raining really, really hard. I'm going to be able to say, God, it was sheeting out today. And you're going to go, oh, wow, that's a lot of rain. So when we look at Indigenous peoples, we see that Indigenous peoples tend to create languages and understandings of their biome that are extremely deep. Homo erectus is an Indigenous group. All the groups that come from Homo erectus are Indigenous groups in the areas that they move into. Homo heidelbergensis in northwest of the Eurasian continent, Denisovian in the southeast of the Eurasian continent. These peoples become indigenous to these areas. Some of these peoples are actually like created in these areas. So they're doubling down on that indigenous, right? So when we look at that, we are seeing groups of human that are indigenous. These are our first instances where we see science is in these groups of humans. So science is I observe something in nature, I think what that observation might mean or have a hypothesis. I predict what that hypothesis will play out like, and then I test my predictions and I test my hypothesis. And if the testing fails, I revert back to the hypothesis. If the testing works, then I move on to the next stage. It's become a theory, and this works. I still retest it all the time. It's something that's constantly going to be retested. We still retest the theory of evolution. We still retest, in fact, the theory of evolution's changed quite a bit. We test the theory of gravity, right? There's a law of gravity and a theory of gravity. We retest the theory of gravity. It is in retesting the theory of race that they debunked the theory of race, because when the testing starts to prove the old hypothesis to be incorrect or the old predictions to be incorrect, then we debunk a theory. So what we see with Homo erectus is Homo erectus seems to be our first species to make changes to tools. We see that Homo habilis for the longest time was thought of to be our first creator of tools, the Oldowan tool complex. We found this year that Paranthropus boisei is actually who created the Oldowan tool complex. We find finds from Paranthropus boisei at 3.3 million years ago that have Oldowan tools. There's a butchering of a hippo with Oldowan tools. So Oldowan tools have a kind of a scraper or a knife within them. They don't have points like a spear point or an arrow point, but they have like a scraper and a knife within them. And then they have uh, what we call hammerstones and cobblestones. Cobblestones are a flat stone or a broad stone that you're going to set on the ground. You're going to put whatever it is you're trying to break on top of it, and you're going to take a hammerstone and crush whatever it is in between, pound whatever it is in between, whether this is leaves and branches or hippo bones or it is uh, grains, right? So this is what hammerstones and cobblestones and hammerstones are, right? So we see within the Oldowan tool complex that they have cobblestones and hammerstones, and then they have a blade. The blade within Oldowan tools is basically just a flake. It's not really a refined blade. Homo erectus takes that and turns it into the Acheulean hand axe assemblage. The Acheulean hand axe still has hammerstone and cobblestones. It still has some of those blades. It also has the Acheulean hand axe itself within it. The Acheulean hand axe is like a teardrop shape. And the top point of it is extremely sharp and it's pointed or sharp around both sides. And then the bottom of it is where you kind of hold it. And it is kind of a little bit more rounded and it fits kind of in the palm of your hand. So to me, having done so much hide work over my life, to me, this looks like a hide scraper personally. You can also use it for many other things. It's thought that they also use it to chop. That's why it's called a hand axe. These are not tools that you're going to be able to hunt with. They are tools that you're going to process with. We see that Homo erectus was the first to take an adaptation, a tool, and adapt that adaptation. This is something that is extremely human. We adapt our adaptations. pretty much everything on this planet has the ability to adapt its surroundings. Well, not pretty much everything. Many animals, and including trees and many plants, have the ability to adapt their surroundings. You'll see that a tree or a plant might actually put out chemicals to adapt the soil so that it's more nutrient rich for itself and things around it. You'll see that the beaver can build a house. You'll see that the fox has a den, right? You'll see that the lions can, go up into trees and kind of like tear up branches and create space within trees. You'll see that gorillas and great apes can actually like create bedding and stuff like that, and will create like nests within trees. Birds create nests. These are adapting our surroundings. Homo sapien and Homo erectus and the other Homo species take these adaptations and then adapt the adaptation. This adapting of the adaptation is where we go from the Acheulean hand axe to the knives that we use today, right? So this is a very early form of science. The other early forms of science that we really see with Homo erectus, we see that Homo erectus is our first instance of the use of fire. We know that Homo erectus has been using fire for roughly 1 million years. We know that Homo erectus's use of fire is this ability to create so much more for them. So first, when we're looking at the use of fire, what we're talking about is not you go out and you grab a branch because a tree got hit by lightning. What we're talking about is the ability to actually control that. Whether it's the ability to, absolutely, whether it's the ability to create a spark, right, using flint and, another stone, or it is the ability to husband fire, keep fire. So there's a couple different ways that we can do that. So you can, like I said, you can like use flint, and this might have been how this comes across is somebody's trying to flint knap and they're hitting stones and they've got leaves down at the bottom of it. And when they're hitting a stone, it sparks and hits those leaves, right? And now we see fire. Oh, wow, that worked like that. Maybe if I try that again. The other possibility with this is, say I come across a tree that has been struck by lightning and it has a big cat in it when it's struck by lightning. And so this big cat is roasted in this tree. And I'm like, wow, that smells really good. And I like that. So I want to be able to do more of that, right? So I decide to take a coal from that tree and take it home with me. Or maybe I take a whole branch home with me. Well, at first I have to figure out that I've got to actually, oh, don't lose hyena teeth. That's not good. First, I have to figure out how to feed it. How do I keep it alive, right? And so that is definitely this experimentation phase of how do I keep this alive? Well, if I put wet wood on it, it's going to die. But if I put these dry leaves on it, it's going to burn up really fast, right? Now I have to figure out how to keep it in between. So say I'm moving, say I want to start it again. I don't want it to go out and not have the ability to not be restarted. So I might take a coal and take that coal and put it aside. I'm just going to put it aside on a rock. And then I realized that putting the coal aside on the rock didn't do jack for it. Like the coal died out on the rock. It didn't work for me. So maybe I decide I know it needs to be fed. So instead, I'm going to take that coal and I'm going to put a little bit of moss around it. Well, it burned through that moss really, really quick and it didn't work. So, okay, I know it has to be fed, but I know it has to be fed not too much, right? So maybe I take and put dry moss around the coal to kind of keep it, but then I put damp moss around that dry moss to kind of keep it from overeating the moss, from feeding too much. And this seems to work, but it seems like if I put it, in this space that there's not a whole lot of air to try and keep it safe, it dies out. Or if I put it in a space where it's too much air, it flames up and it eats the moss again. So now I know I need to keep it inside of something that has some airflow, but not too much airflow. All of these are different types of experimentation phases that are possibilities for the starting of the keeping of fire. How do we know what they did? We don't. How do we know the possibilities? Because these are the things that we've seen throughout history that have been taught and been used. And these are the ways that you get to those spaces, right? Or the experimentation phases to get there. So this is really our early use of science. For me, fire is probably the most important invention that we have, or the most important control discovery that we have. This is because from fire, we get so much. Not only do we get community, Not only do we get protection, because if you have fire inside a cave, a big cat's not going to enter that cave, but we also get the ability to cook our food. Cooking food is really important for our species and really important for other prior Homo species as well, because the cooking of the food gives greater caloric intake for less amount of food. So you can have a couple of ounces that is cooked versus a couple of ounces that's uncooked, and you're going to get more calories out of the cooked because it pre-digests our food for it. So it's easier for our body to get everything out of it. When this happens in pregnancy or in neonates or in the developing brained people, so currently we know that our personal brain stops developing at 25. This is when the frontal lobe fully closes. So, up till that point, the development of the brain, the more calories that you give it, the more extra calories from your daily needs that you give it, the bigger it grows. So, if I am especially depending on what it is. Like if I'm eating a lot of fish oils or if I'm eating a lot of proteins, I'm going to, if I'm carrying a child, those extra calories are going to go to the brain development of the baby in utero. If I am feeding a child from my breast, the extra calories going into my milk are going to go into that brain development. If I am feeding a small child, the extra calories that they get from all of their play, everything left over is going to go towards the brain development. And so it is this use of fire that gives us larger brains. We know now that it's not the size of our brain, but the shape of our brain that is important. But we also know that size has something to do with it, right? And so that ability to have those bigger brains comes from this early Homo erectus use of fire. The other thing fire gives you is the ability to have hunting tools that you might not necessarily see otherwise. So, as we were talking with the Acheulean hand axe, the Acheulean hand axe isn't going to be a tool that you can go hunting with. They're usually like 6 inches, they're usually pretty big. And at this point, they've got this kind of wide, broad bottom so that you can hold it in your hand. This isn't something that you're able to really put into a piece of wood. Um, we don't really see the invention of glue to be able to do that until Neanderthals, A, and B, they're not really tools that the shape of, like there's no place to tang it, if that makes sense. Let me see if I can do it in a different manner. So if you're looking at like an arrowhead or a spearhead, there's almost like a gouge out that you fit it into the shaft of a piece of wood. There is none of this in the Acheulean hand axe assemblage. So this is not something that's going into a piece of wood to be used for hunting. And something that's like 6 inches that you're holding in your hand, you're not going to survive if you're running up on something to kill it, right? So if there's like six of us and we're all holding these 6 inch things in our hand and we're running up on this big old water buffalo and trying to stab this water buffalo, we're not going to kill this water buffalo before we're dead. So it's not something that you're usually using or that you are using for hunting. It's for processing. Um, well, that's probably because I was talking about size versus. um, but fire gives us the ability to create a spear that actually works, right? So when we're looking at a spear that actually works, if you were to take a piece of wood, say you go out into your yard and you cut a branch off the tree and it's a nice straight branch, so you're going to make a spear out of it, and you take your knife and you sharpen the end of that branch and you get a really nice point on it. Say you decide to chuck that branch at a bale of hay or your brother because you're a kid, right? You see that the tip mushrooms out. When you sharpen the tip of something with a knife, you're breaking the integrity of it. And in breaking the integrity of it, you can get a really small or a really sharp point, but that point has no integrity to it. So the minute it hits something, it mushrooms, it busts. Whereas if you take that same branch and you have a fire and you heat that branch, put it next to the fire, across the rocks, just kind of next to it till it gets really nice and hot. And then you roll it away, let it cool down. And then you push it back towards the fire and you let it heat up. And then you roll it away and let it cool down. This tempers the wood. So this makes this wood much harder. So this wood is more capable of not busting, A. And then if you can take and put the point of that branch into the fire and get a nice coal on it or a little bit of fire on the end of it, and then you can sharpen it by great sanding it on a firestone or a stone on your hearth, you can get a really sharp point without breaking the integrity of the wood. So when you use this spear, it will actually puncture a hide so that you can actually kill. So fire gives us so many different things. It gives us community, it gives us protection, it gives us better calories, and it gives us a better ability to hunt than we would have had at the time. This is absolutely science. We see that Homo erectus has so many different skills that they have along this. We know now that Homo erectus has language. We can see that there is the patterns of language center in their skull. So your brain actually, like in its push against your skull, will actually leave patterns in the brain case, in your skull case, the interior of it, right? So we can see those language patterns in the skull of Homo erectus. We also know that lung capacity and the way that the lungs are shaped actually has a lot to do with it as well because of the expulsion of breath, right, through the voice box. And so we see with Homo erectus, they have this as well. We know now that Homo erectus also had the use of clothing. And one of the ways that we know this is that we see body lice is about 170,000 years old. Body lice needed like 1 million years to come about, right? So body lice are a speciation from head lice. And when we had hair all over our body, head lice was all over our body because it's hair lice, right? It lives in our hair. When we lose the hair all over our body, I don't know if you've ever seen head lice. They can be very big. I mean, not like big, big, but big, right? So if I see a head lice on my body, I'm going to eat it at this time frame. Okay. I'm going to think protein, right? So it's not going to survive. If I put clothing on, right, then I'm not going to see when the lice is on my body. So to get to the speciation of body lice from head lice, we had to both be hairless and be wearing some form of a body cover. So we know that Homo erectus is our first to use clothing. Now, think of this as, making a poncho out of a deer hide, right? Cut a hole in the middle of it, and now you've got a poncho that you're wearing. This is not tailored fitted clothing. That does not come until later with the Neanderthals. When we're looking at that, what we're seeing is that this ability to wear clothing is definitely something that they're passing down, and is also something that they're really using to kind of get around the globe, because we absolutely see Homo erectus, which is a species that develops in an extremely hot environment, able to go into very cold environments. And that ability to go into very cold environments really comes from their ability to cover their body. We also see with Homo erectus that they have the ability to cross water. We know that they crossed water with Florensis because Florensis is in an island in Indonesia that is within the Wallace Trench. And so it's never been connected to land. Hi, Nana. And when because it's never been connected to land, we see that they had to cross water to get to there. This is Homo florensis, and this is a descendant of Homo erectus. We see that the new find in the Philippines of Homo luzonensis is absolutely crossing that Wallace Trench to get down to the island within the Philippines. So we see that this ability to cross water comes early on. We do know that there is a speciation here in the Turtle Islands from Homo erectus. The Cerruti mastodon find shows us, and we'll talk about that one a little bit more. And we do know that there is a ghost species and a 120,000-year-old find in Australia. Both of these are descendants of Homo erectus who are making it into these spaces. And we'll talk a little bit more about ghost species in a couple as well. So we're definitely seeing that Homo erectus has all of these absolute capabilities to make it across the globe. We're seeing that medicine is something we see as early as the Neanderthals. We see evidence of tended broken bones within the Neanderthals. We have two that we call the old men, though one is absolutely female. We have the old man of La Chapelle, and we have the old man of Shanidar, Shanidar 1. And Shanidar 1 is who we got Kreb from the Earth's Children series by Jean M. All. So Kreb, or Shanidar 1, his arm was like, so it seems like he had some damage to his brain, like he got a blow to the head, whether it was, a skull or a rock collapse and got hit in the head. We're not sure how he got hit in the head, but he had a blow to the head that caused him to be blind in one eye and caused him to be partially deaf or fully deaf in one ear and partially deaf in the other ear. And then this caused some neurological damage. So his arm withered and his leg withered. And this withering of his arm and his leg really are things that, first of all, he had to have some help through the blow to the head, right? He had to have somebody there with him while he survived that, because that's not something you're surviving on your own. And then the care and tending that he had to have afterwards. We see the same thing with La Chapelle. La Chapelle seems to have lost part of their forearm, or not part of their forearm on the right side, I think it is. And so in this loss of the forearm on La Chapelle, this is something that you're absolutely going to see some medicine actually has to come across with. When we look at this, we can see that this pushes forward too. We do see with Neanderthals that they're using herbs, they're using medicinal herbs. We can tell this from the plaque on their teeth that we've tested. We can see that there are herbs in that plaque that are bitter herbs. They're not herbs that they're going to be using to actually like flavor their food. They have no caloric properties, so they're not herbs that they're eating to actually keep themselves alive from need of calorie intake. And they are directly related to the medical needs that we can see in some of these Neanderthals as well. And so we see that they're using herbology as well. When we push this down into Homo sapien, we see that our earliest I'm absolutely take questions. I just don't take people up for like the chat things like the panels in these, but I absolutely take questions. So our earliest use of alcohol that we know of currently is mead, made in South Africa. This is in a hollow log, made in a hollow log in South Africa. And my understanding is it's like 25,000 years old. That's the current oldest alcohol that I know of currently. It is definitely us by this point. Um, and it's mead, which is really cool. So we see that there's a find that came out last year in Borneo. And the find that came out last year in Borneo is a total foot amputation. Now, there's a lot of information that this gives us. First, we know that the person lived for 6 to 9 years after their foot was amputated. And we can tell this by the remodeling or the growth of the bone after the amputation. When a bone gets damaged, it starts what we call a remodeling thing, where it just kind of grows bone to replace the damaged bone. So when we look at the remodeling of the amputation of the foot, we can see that it had happened 6 to 9 years before the person died. That in itself gives us a wealth of information. So the first thing that we're seeing with this is that we can tell by the fineness of the cut that they knew enough to use an obsidian blade. Obsidian is a property that can be sharpened. How do I say that? Obsidian is like one of the hardest things on the planet. And because it can be flaked, it can be sharpened to the finest point or the finest blade that we can get. Today, they still use obsidian scalpels in surgeries when you're doing microsurgery, because obsidian is the only thing that we have that can actually cut between cells. So we can see that this amputation was done with an obsidian blade by the fineness of the cut, the smoothness of the cut. We can also see that they had to have some knowledge of anatomy to do this because of the fact that they didn't bleed out, for one, right? So to create an amputation that is not going to be problematic later, that somebody is going to be able to heal from, you have to take the bone here, you have to pull the skin up. So if I've got my skin here, I'm going to pull it up, right? Now I'm going to saw through the bone here with this skin pulled up. Okay. And then when I saw through the bone, I'm going to release, and it's gone. I'm going to release the skin so it drops down so it covers the end of the bone. If you leave an exposed bone end, it's going to infect. So we know that they had to know enough to pull the skin back to do the saw through and then let the skin drop. This also is indicating that they knew enough to leave the extra flap of skin to go over. Again, we're not seeing any infection in this bone. This also indicates that they knew enough to either cauterize or tie off the blood vessels in the leg. It's most likely cauterization, though tying off with catgut would have worked just as well. That's a possibility as well. So this also tells us that they had to have an antiseptic herb that they're using because we see that there is no infection and this person lives 6 to 9 years. So they had to know enough of antiseptic to know to make sure everything's clean. And it's most likely that what they would do is take a tool and put it in a tea or a tincture made of antiseptic to clean it before they're doing the cut. And then they're cleaning the cut with this antiseptic and then probably giving an antiseptic tea afterwards. At least that would be our assumption based on our medical knowledge, based on what we're seeing with this find. The other thing that we believe is that they also had to have knowledge of anesthesia, and there are anesthetic and anesthesic herbs in the area. So we know that a lower limb amputation without some form of anesthesia or without the patient being completely knocked out usually ends in death. What it is that if you're awake when your lower limb is being cut off, your body goes into shock because your mind can't comprehend it. Your mind can't comprehend the loss of the ability to walk, the loss of the ability to take care of yourself. There is a difference in amputating a lower limb versus amputating an upper limb. It is way more traumatic to the mind and the body to amputate a lower limb. So we know that during the Civil War, for example, that most of the amputations that happened during the Civil War that were successful happened because the patient was completely comatose when it happened, or because the patient was given morphine. There are antiseptic and anesthetic herbs in the area. This is in Borneo. And so we believe that through, well, they called in like medical experts and they called in medical anthropology. Like they did a lot of research on this. The beliefs point to the ability to have all of these things. This tells us that this is not your first surgery, right? You don't have a picture perfect textbook could be teaching doctors today surgery your first time out the gate. I was a radiographer before I was an archaeologist. And in radiography, I was involved in many surgeries. And I have been involved in, limb amputations. I've been involved in replacements and stuff like that. The tools that we use today are, surgical steel, but you can get them from Home Depot. They're pretty crude. And the replacement tool or the things that we replace with today are also pretty crude. And most amputations today, like if you're amputating, you're kind of using a skill saw. Like it's not a very fine, beautiful amputation. So this is an amputation that is not only textbook perfect, but could teach people today, right? And so this is not their first time. It's likely because, groups at this point are not going to be thousands of people. They're going to be a few hundred in a group at top, more likely to be groups of like 50 to 60. This is 30,000 years ago, 31,000 years ago. So what we're most likely looking at is a broader community. There are healers within, and those healers are comparing stories and teaching each other, right? And that this has gone on for a couple of generations. It is most likely that this is, something that has been done several times before to get to this point, this knowledge and everything else within it. Um, so this is in Borneo at 31,000 years ago. This is an indigenous group of people 31,000 years ago. We see that when Europeans get to the Turtle Islands, that they find an advanced science and advanced medicine here, and they actually document it in all of their conversations. They document the Turtle Islands as being a tended ecological, just beautiful garden, coast to coast, north to south, all documentations by the Europeans. So people like to think, it starts in like 1492, but then, Plymouth Rock. But the fact of the matter is there are raids up and down yes, it's in North America. I use Turtle Islands as in North and South America personally because I'm still not the best at saying abeya yala, and I don't like butchering indigenous words. So I just use it for both currently. But yes, I'm talking about the Americas. We see that for absolutely that first 100 years between Columbus landing on the Taino people and Plymouth Rock, that there are well, yeah, landing on Plymouth Rock works, that there are raids up and down the East Coast. And these raids up and down the East Coast, this is how Squanto was actually able to speak English because he had been taken as a small boy and captured and enslaved and escaped. And in all of these raids, we're seeing documentation of vast tended gardens. The ecological advancement of people here in the Turtle Islands was something that we hadn't seen in Europe for a long time. And I state that because Christianity takes over Europe in roughly 400. And when Christianity takes over Europe, so at this point, Rome has covered pretty much most of Western Eurasia. Excuse me. They have really taken over and colonized most of Western Eurasia. And in their colonization of most of Western Eurasia, when they impose a state religion in 400, that state religion really goes to everybody. It really becomes a part of everybody's life in the spaces that they have colonized. And so at this point, you see the eradication of indigenous medicine and the eradication of indigenous science across the space, because Christianity is ruled by a jealous God. And because he is a jealous God, he doesn't want you to question him. He wants you to blindly follow him. And science questions God. And medicine is seen as taking God into your own hands, right? If I can save your life and God wants you to be dead anyways, then I'm kind of taking away God's decision-making skills in this. So we see that Christianity removes science and medicine in all places that it conquers. And again, that's because we're dealing with a God that does not like to be questioned and a God that does not like to be circumvented, right? We see that during this time, science and medicine does exist in many spaces in Eurasia. Asia is still extremely advanced in their science and medicine. They've never lost that. Any space that is conquered by Islam, or any space that is an Islamic space, is still extremely advanced in science and medicine. We actually see that many Europeans will travel to Islamic spaces to study medicine and study science. If they bring it back to Europe, though, they have to kind of hide it, because if they bring it back to Europe, they can get in a lot of trouble. Even in the Arabic spaces, though, even in the Islamic spaces, though, you're seeing that it's still not okay to cut into the body. It's still not okay to remove an appendix, say, or something like that. You can amputate or cut off a limb, but you can't actually cut into the body and remove something, right? So when the Europeans get to the Turtle Islands and they see this really advanced science and medicine, this is really where we see the Europeans start to get science and medicine back. Like, they start to understand that science and medicine is okay again. Before this, they've been able to equate it with sin. And so they have been able to state that the Islamic people who are following it are obviously sinful. All early documentation of indigenous people in the Turtle Islands, though, is documentation of Columbus actually names them Los de los Indios, and or Los Dios Indios, and this is the children of God. This is one of the theories on how we get the name Indian. India was not India at the time. India was Hindustan at the time. It was along the Indus River, but it was not India. So he was not naming them Indians for India. The word comes to the best indigenous knowledge that I've seen. The best knowledge that I've seen coming from indigenous people, it comes from the phrase Los de los Indios, which literally translates to the children of God. When Europeans get to the Turtle Islands, they very much see that the indigenous people of the Turtle Islands are very They call them naive. I don't like that terminology because that terminology has a tendency to have some negative connotations in it. Really, what it is that there is this belief that life is the most important thing, right? And this belief in the need to not control the biome, but to be a part of the biome. And because of this, we see that the knowledge that Indigenous people have of their biome at this time is extremely advanced compared to other areas in the world, which is why we see that north to south, east to west, coast to coast, it does not matter. The entire place was a tendon garden. Documented on the East Coast. When the Spaniards reached California, it's documented in California as well. It's documented all through South America. Um, in this advanced science comparatively, and in this advanced medicine comparatively, we see that the Europeans start moving towards this understanding of what it is again. Now, of course, being the Europeans, they don't give credit. And of course, being the Europeans and believing that they are still pinnacle, they decided to take it back to the ancient Greeks, which is problematic as well because the ancient Greeks aren't very the ancient Greek medicine is really cool on a lot of levels, but it also really hates women. And because it really hates women, it's not really healthy for the whole body, right? It's healthy for maybe certain people, but not really. We get the word hysteria from the belief that the ancient Greeks had that the womb actually wandered throughout the body, and that when the womb wandered throughout the body, somebody would become hysterical. So, when we're looking at that, what we're seeing is that this knowledge here really becomes the knowledge we see throughout the world. It takes a while, and Western science and Western medicine are not near as advanced as Indigenous medicine was, or Indigenous science was, or science and medicine in other areas like the East. Uh, as we bring Indigenous people in, and as we bring people from other parts of the world that are not Western controlled, Africa, Asia, once we start bringing those people in, we start to see these great advancements of science and medicine that we have seen recently. So we definitely see that not only are science and medicine indigenous, that they were maintained in and always have been maintained in indigenous spaces, and that this knowledge goes back prior to us. This knowledge goes back, this understanding goes back 2 million years, or at least 1.5 million. This kind of really falls into that knowledge that evolution isn't linear, that nothing is really linear. It can be circular sometimes, um, it can be wavy sometimes, but nothing is really linear when it comes to us. Nothing is really linear when it comes to evolution. Nothing is really linear when it comes to the world itself, right? The world itself isn't really a linear thing. So, we've recently had publications that have stated unequivocally to the public that science or that evolution is not linear. Most people within evolution fields have known that for a long time. Homo naledi is one of those beautiful proofs that evolution isn't linear. Homo naledi is a species that from the L spine down is Homo erectus style, like it's Homo. It's got that expedient bipedalism that all Homo species have. And from the L spine up, it looks more like Lucy, Australopithecine. It also has a very small brain case like Australopithecine, yet its brain shape is the brain shape that we don't see in sapiens until 40,000 years ago. So the brain shape that they have is that globular lobal brain shape. So early sapiens, Homo erectus, Neanderthal, we all have brains kind of like this. Brain cases kind of like this. This is our skull, this is our spine, and then we got this sticky out part in the behind, right? And as we start to develop, that sticky out part in the behind comes down and looks like this instead. Homo naledi actually has that globular lobal brain. Now, we believe that the lobes of our brain are part of the reason that we're as intelligent as we are. And we believe that it is this globular or circular shape that is part of the reason that we're as intelligent as we are. Part of this comes from the fact that Naledi is like that. Part of this comes from the fact that Neanderthal had bigger brains than we did, and we can't not be the best, right? We've got smaller brains than Neanderthals, so it can't obviously be the big brain. It has to be something else, right? Um, but we definitely see that start of that shape of that change come later on. Naledi, though, has it when we come into being, and we don't have it at the time. So this is one species where you see them staying the same in Erectus, reverting in Australopithecine in the upper body, and then going like 300,000 years into the future in the shape of the brain. This is also why we see them burying their dead and carving in cave walls and having that identity, that sense of identity that we see in us and in Neanderthals much later on. We don't see it in us and Neanderthals until after 100,000 years ago. Um, so this is one of those really beautiful examples about how evolution really is not a linear thing. We're going to go over a little bit of what the other species that we see as well are. And in those, we're going to go over a couple of other things, I think. Let me make sure. Okay, so our oldest hominin currently that we see is 7 million years old. This is a find that came out last year. Saleoanthropus tadici, we've known about for a while, but we haven't had the brain case of Saleoanthropus tadici. We've had the lower body, and we thought that they were an upright walker. But it wasn't until we found their skull in a lake bed in Chad last year. Well, we probably found it a couple years before, but they published last year, that we saw that Saleoanthropus tadici is actually fully upright. And we see this because of where the foramen magnum is in the skull. So the foramen magnum is that hole that we have at the base of our skull that the spinal cord comes out of that goes into our skull. If you're looking at somebody who walks on four legs, this is their skull. The hole is here. Your dog's hole for his foramen magnum is back here. It's not underneath here. So when we look at Saleoanthropus tadici, the hole is here. Actually, I think it's a little bit more here. So you can see that it's that transition period, but that they're pretty much fully upright at this point of time. I can't go into all the different species that have ever existed of hominins between Saleoanthropus tadici and the first Homo habilis, right? The first Homo species. But I can go into some of the things that we know about the other Homo species, mainly the things that we know about the other Homo species that we lived alongside of. So we know that Homo erectus really makes it across the globe. We know now that Homo erectus was able to make it to Australia, was able to make it to North America, and we know that they made it to the island of Flores and the island of Luzon. And so we know that they're able to make it really around the globe and cross water. In each of those spaces, they kind of are isolated. And in that isolation in each of those spaces, they develop new species. So speciation comes from a couple of different things. Usually speciation comes from being isolated from the rest of your group and adapting to the area that you're in. And after a few 100,000 years, all those adaptations kind of morph together and you become an entirely different species. It's important to note that if my grandmother is Heidelbergensis and I'm Neanderthal, my grandmother is not going to look at me as a separate species. She's going to look at me as the same species. It's not going to be until 600,000 years later that somebody else looks at us and goes, "Oh, you're a different species than your grandmother," you know? And it's definitely, something to understand and recognize that these species are not seeing them as different species. They're seeing people that are their children and their grandchildren and their cousins, right? The other way that we see species develop is really a new revelation for us. We see that our species itself and possibly Homo erectus really develops out of a mixing of many species. We'll touch on that a little bit. When we look at the other species that are developing across the globe, what we're seeing is that starting with our first find, which is in 1854, 56, something like that, in Neander Valley or Neanderthal in Germany, that there is road construction and they find a skull and they go, wow, that's some weird morphology to that skull. And so somebody starts studying it. And it's not until a few years later when Darwin's theory of evolution gets published And when Darwin's theory of evolution gets published, they start to go, oh, this must be an older species of man. They think that there are ancestors at this time. Um, they really use Neanderthal to kind of double down on the eugenics theory that develops with the theory of evolution. This is really because at this point of time, they think that the world is 6,000 years old, that God developed it. And they have legitimized their atrocities of racial horror and genocide by deciding that those who have darker skin carry the mark of Ham or the mark of Cain. In the Bible, after Cain is expelled, he goes on to find other people and impregnate somebody and have children. And he has a son named Ham. And Ham is given the opportunity to return to God, and Ham decides that he doesn't want to return to God, and so he carries the mark. And when Christianity decides to make their othering based on skin color or origin of people, they use this to state that those who are darker of skin carry the mark of Cain on them. And therefore, this is why it's possible to harm them because that's what God intended. Um, at this point in the 1850s, when theory of evolution comes out, we see that, Europeans have been justifying this atrocity for, God, what is it, 400 years by then, right? And they can't just decide, well, shit, we were being shitty human beings. They can't just decide that they don't have the right to harm anybody anymore because, well, America's still got slaves, right? I don't think Britain does at the time. Britain ends slavery before we do. But America still definitely has slaves. And they have to figure out a way to make this not be them being the evil shits they're being, basically. And so what they do is decide that it has to do with evolution and that they must be more primitive and therefore it's okay for the more advanced white race. Race has been debunked, of course, but they are talking, or and they are talking of race at this time. This is our evolution of the theory of race even comes in at this time. So um, they compare Neanderthal to Africans at this time and decide that this means that Africans are less advanced and so that therefore they can cause this harm. When we see that with Neanderthal, we see that Neanderthal is thought to be the species that we descend from quite some time. And it's not for like another 50 years before they even find the Homo erectus spine. We see that they find the Homo erectus spine in the late 1800s. They don't find anything else. They find Homo erectus and Homo habilis roughly the same time. They find Heidelbergensis and antecessor and all these others, over the course of the next 100 years. It is understood that all of these other species predate us at this time, right? Um, and at this time, uh, they're still under the impression that erectus goes to, the habilis goes to erectus, and erectus goes to Heidelbergensis, and Heidelbergensis goes to Neanderthal, and Neanderthal goes to us, right? And it's not until much later that we start to realize that we're not descendant from Neanderthal. Neanderthal, found in 1850s, is our only other species that we see of living alongside us for 150 years. So in 2003, they find Homo florensis in the Isle of Flores in Indonesia. Homo florensis is 3'5" at its largest height and has large feet. 2003 is like the year after The Hobbit came out, or not The Hobbit, but Lord of the Rings came out, right? And so you see that they're automatically dubbed the Hobbit species. It is our first understanding, though, of other species that are living alongside us other than Neanderthal. We think for a while that this is it. We ignore a lot of the information that we get from the Indonesians on Flores Island, and we study them. In 2000, roughly at the same time that we see Homo florensis, actually, we start to see the advent of polymerase chain reaction, which we were talking about earlier. Polymerase chain reaction is this testing or this technique that takes a singular strand of DNA and multiplies it by millions. It was developed by Sponte Pablo, Sponte Pablo, who won the Nobel Peace Prize last year for polymerase chain reaction. And so we aren't able to test uh, Flores. We start testing or Florensis, and we start testing Neanderthals. Um, we have a cave in Russia called Denisova. And in the cave in Russia, there are literally millions of little chunks of bone. None of them are over like 2 or 3 inches. They're just millions of little pieces of bone. And so we start testing some of these. We get a fingertip, a phalange, just a little bit of a finger. And when we get that and test it, we find a whole new species. And that's when we find Denisova. And this is in 2010. Because we are able to test Denisova and get a full genome out of Denisova, and have at this point of time been able to test Neanderthal and get a full genome out of Neanderthal, we're able to compare them to us and see that we have Neanderthal DNA and Denisova DNA. We're unable to test Florensis, and the reason is the way DNA degrades. Every element has what's called a half-life. And a half life is the rate of time it takes for something to decay by half. So I'm going to use words that are arbitrary, but they're easy for me. If you have 100 strands of DNA when you die, your DNA replicates the entire time you're alive. Your DNA is replicating as you are sitting here now. Every 7 years, we've replaced every cell in our body. Your DNA is constantly replicating. So when you die, that replication process stops, and we go into the degradation of the DNA in a half-life phase. So a half-life is the rate of time it takes for it to decay by half. If we have 100 strands of DNA, and we take that 100 strands of DNA and lose half of it in our first day, say a day is our half life, then by the end of that first day, we only have 50 strands of DNA left. Our second day, we start with 50 strands of DNA and we lose 25 strands of DNA, that half. And the end of the day, we have 25 left. By the start of the third day, we start with 12.5 or 25 strands. We lose 12.5, and the end of the day, we have 12.5 left. And you can see how this means that you might get little fragments, but you're not going to get a whole thing, right? So when we're looking at that, we're seeing that ancient DNA or DNA will actually dissolve faster in certain areas. If you are in an extremely cold, extremely dry environment, your DNA will last longer. If you are fully submerged like bog bodies, your DNA will last longer. But if you are in a hot, humid environment or a hot, wet environment, your DNA will leave relatively swiftly. So we see that Florensis is unlikely to ever give us DNA just because of the fact that they're in an extremely hot, extremely humid environment. We have not gotten DNA from Florensis. After Denisova in 2010, we discovered Naledi in 2012. And then in the last 4 years, I think it's 2017, we find Homo luzonensis. Maybe it was 2019, we find Homo luzonensis. Roughly the same time we find Homo luzonensis, we have a skull that we have seen in a cave in China, Long Cave in China, that we had for a while. I think they pulled the skull out in like the 70s, but we hadn't really taken a look at it as being an entirely different species. And when we look at Longi again in 2020, we start to realize that Longi is a whole different species. To this date, we do not know if Longi is actually a Denisovan skull or if it is an entirely new species. We won't know until we find another skull that is shaped like Longi and can possibly get DNA out of it. So we haven't been able to get DNA out of Longi. Of course, being pulled in the 70s means that they haven't like really been able to preserve it very well, anyways. And we do not have like a skull of Denisova. All we have of Denisova that's the closest to the skull is we have like a little chunk of the base of their skull, which tells us that they had language. And we have a mandible, just a piece of the mandible, too. I think it's only like half of the mandible. Um, so we're unable to compare Longi's skull to Denisova to see if Longi and Denisova is the same. Currently, we know that we have 6 species that are all around at the time that we start and who live well. So Homo florensis, the PhD, the doctorate of anthropology, a doctor of anthropology who has been studying Homo florensis since they found Homo florensis in 2003. Um, so the people of the island of Flores have been telling people this entire time that we have 3 foot tall people living in our woods. Like they're like, those little people are still out there. Like they have been part of the legends of the people of Flores, and there have been sightings of them as recently as 50 years ago. So currently, doctor of anthropology is down there studying as to whether or not Homo florensis is still alive. It is possible that we have another species that is still alive alongside us. Um, there is also the knowledge that Denisova doesn't die out until about 13,000 years ago, and Neanderthal doesn't die out until about 30,000 years ago. So these species are very much here with us for a long period of time. I believe that the understanding of Luzonensis, though it's so new that I do not have a lot of depth on it, is that they were here like 40,000 years ago or 30,000 years ago. Um, so these are all species that are with us when we start. Homo naledi is actually in the Rising Star Caves in South Africa, the Naledi Caves in South Africa, and we're seeing that they are 335 to 235,000 years ago. So they're definitely like there when we start. Um, all evidence shows that we got along with these other species like we get along with a hot guy at the bar. Like all evidence shows that every time we see a new species, we have sex. All evidence shows with this admixture that we have from everything around the globe that we're very into, oh, you're pretty and you're strange and I've never seen your type before. Let's go. All evidence shows that, and all evidence supports that it is very much this constant, like I was saying earlier, this constant groups of bands living together. In Denisova Cave, we see that Denisova and Neanderthal. There's somebody right outside my door. Bran, Bran, stop it. It's okay. They're not coming in here. They're showing that apartment. Nope. You need to stop now. You're done. Thank you. All evidence shows that when we come across these different species, what we do is we mix. This is how we have Neanderthal and Denisova in us. We do know that we lived with Neanderthal and Denisova in the Denisova cave. We know that we lived with Neanderthal in several different caves in West Eurasia. Excuse me. And we know that we lived with Neanderthal in the Levant and in the Arabian Peninsula. All evidence shows that every time we see these other species, we mixed with them. So we also have something called ghost species. And ghost species are species that we see just a little bit of them in our DNA or in other DNA, but we have not found them, so we don't have a full genome of them. Or if we have found them, like maybe, Florensis, we haven't gotten the DNA out of it, so we're not sure that we don't know that it's them, right? So we have 5 ghost species within our DNA and 1 ghost species in Neanderthal and Denisova DNA that we do not see in our DNA. So this gives us 6 ghost species that we're all living alongside of and mixing with. The 5 ghost species that we see within our DNA, we see 3 in 2 spaces in Africa. So all of Africa has Neanderthal DNA. This is because of that mixing in the Levant area and the fact that we're constantly migrating anyway. So we're going back and forth. I'm sitting in the Levant area in these caves, and I've got cat hair all over my face. We're sitting in the Levant area in these caves, and we're hanging out with the Neanderthals in their cave 5 minutes walk from us, and we're learning new tools and we're mixing it up. And then we're going back home to Africa, and we're going back home to different spaces in Africa, and we're taking that genealogy with us. We're taking that DNA with us. So our evidence from Neanderthal DNA in Africa comes from pre-colonization, comes from finds pre-colonization. We see that Neanderthal is everywhere in Africa except for the Oyo population of West Africa and the Kwe population of South Africa. Within these two populations, we see three ghost species. These are species that we lived alongside of, species that we obviously bred with. We do not know of them in the fossil record. We have not found them, so we do not know who they are yet. We see within Indigenous Australians another ghost species, and we see within Indigenous Turtle Islanders another ghost species. Now, we touched a little bit earlier on the fact that there are new finds in Australia and in Turtle Island that push the dating of hominins on those islands back. So the find that we see here in the Turtle Islands is 130,000 years ago. This is the Cerruti mastodon find in San Diego, California. It is headed by the principal archaeologist of the San Diego Natural History Museum. So dude's got cred, like he's got some backup on this. And they did a lot of different testing. They did a lot of different forms of archaeological testing to double down on this. The Cerruti mastodon find is juvenile mastodon bones, what we call in situ, which means laying in the layer that they were, buried in or covered in, right? And among in situ with hammerstones and cobblestones, like I was describing earlier. Again, cobblestones are flat stones that we place on the ground. We put something on top of them and we take the hammerstone and we pound until we can break that up. So what we're seeing with the juvenile mastodon bones is that the hammerstones and cobblestones are showing chipping on them in the exact way that they would get from crushing wet bone. That the bone itself shows fracturing and spiral fracturing in patterns that you only get with wet bone. A lot of people want to say, oh, this is because when they were doing the construction, that the shovel from the construction tools broke up these bones, and that's what it is. The problem with that is that dry bone cracks differently than wet bone. Bone that is either still within the body or freshly out of the body is going to not crack as fine. It's not going to break apart as easily. It's going to kind of like, I always like to use the word toast here. So if you take a piece of toast and you butter it and you try and tear apart that piece of toast or break that piece of toast, it kind of tears. It doesn't break clean. Whereas if you leave that piece of toast to sit out for a week, you can snap it and it breaks clean, right? So spiral fractures are something that you only get from a pull and a twist. Spiral fractures are what we call a nursemaid, no, not nursemaid fracture. There's something else that's a nursemaid fracture, but they are something that we attribute to abuse in children because of the fact that when spiral fractures happen because somebody has pulled and twisted the bone deliberately. So when we see this, we know that the spiral fractures, green stick fractures are different. So green stick fractures is kind of a dent in the bone, or it's a break that doesn't go all the way through. A spiral fracture actually fractures the bone, but it's fractured in a circular pattern, in a spiraling pattern. Aside, my 16-year-old, when he was a year and a half old, we had just got him these new pair of sandals, those high sandals with the strappies across the top. He loved them. He was wearing them. He's a shoe boy. He's always been a shoe boy. And I had been vacuuming our living room and I had a cord across our living room and he's running across our living room and he hits that and twists his leg and gets a spiral fracture on his leg. And so when this happens, I take him in the hospital. I know he's broken his leg. I take him in and I'm looking at the x-rays. I'm doing radiography at this time. I know. And I looked and I'm like, holy shit. Literally, really, I'm like, dude, don't call CPS. I'm telling you the fucking truth. You could talk to the child. Like that is what fucking happened, right? But spiraling and what it is when the bone breaks because of the twisting action, it instead of like breaking in a straight line, it breaks in almost this like a curve pattern. And that's why they call it a spiral fracture, right? So we see that spiral fracturing is happening with these juvenile mastodon bones, which is again one of those things where it must be wet and it must be twisted and pulled to happen, or twisted to happen. So not only that, but the other fracturing patterns within them are all the same kind of fracturing patterns that you get from a hammering and cobbling, breaking apart bone on purpose between two stones, as well as in wet bones. So this is a find where this is 130,000 years ago. Um, if you've ever been a hunter, if you've ever been part of a large community that hunts, or if you've ever done any study on this, you know that um, if 10 of us are out and we kill a mastodon, we need to get the shit out of there as fast as we can because there's other predators who are going to come in and try and eat our food. And if we're here, they're going to eat us. So, what we're seeing with this and what has been impossible and not impossible then. What we're seeing in this is that it is a processing of the bone quickly to get marrow and to get tools like needles and awls out of the bone. And so they're breaking this bone, they're getting as much as they can, and they're getting the fuck out before the next big thing comes along to kill them. This again is 130,000 years ago. This is not us. We are not really outside of Africa at this point. Where we are outside of Africa is really only in the Levant area at this point. All indication and all agreement is that this is a descendant of Homo erectus, just like Homo erectus has made it everywhere else and speciates into a species. So this is a find of a Homo erectus group. And this would also be the ghost species that we see in Turtle Island indigenous DNA. So when we meet up with all of these different groups, we've enveloped all of these different groups within us. This is how we get Denisova DNA. This is how we get Neanderthal DNA. This is how we get the ghost species DNA. Oh, you're pretty, you're hot. Let's all live together, right? So when sapiens get to Turtle Islands and they encounter this species that is here that is speciated from Erectus, the likelihood is that that species is probably not very populous. It doesn't seem like any of the species that speciated out of Homo erectus alone or out of the species from Homo erectus like Heidelbergensis, Antecessor, Ergaster, actually are very populous. They all seem to be extremely small species, and this is probably because of a narrow of genetic diversity. That's awesome. A narrowing of genetic diversity within the species because they're coming from a singular species and they're coming from a singular species of which there's only a few by the time they make it to these spaces. So all indications are is that when sapien makes it to Turtle Island, they envelop this species within them. In Australia, we see the Moyhill site. The Moyhill site is 120,000 years old. It is fire charred rock and uh, shells, broken shells. It's not one that I have seen a whole lot of in-depth study on. I know that they're doing some study on, they're working on more study on. So I haven't been able to get the most amount of information out of it, or at least as extensive information as I have been able to get on the Cerruti mastodon find. But we also see within Indigenous Australians that there is a ghost species. And so this would indicate that when Indigenous Australians get to Australia 70,000 years ago, they encountered this species that is again a descendant from Homo erectus that they envelop within them. And this is how Indigenous Australians get their ghost species. So together, this shows us 12 different species alive when we, yes, kind of. 12 different species alive when we are coming onto the scene. How to properly read these studies can be really hard. So, um, I can tell you how to make sure that the studies are legitimate and how to make sure that the articles that you're reading are legitimate, right? So, if you are looking at an article and it doesn't reference anybody and it has no sources, you're not going to want to use this article. Um, an article should have a few different sources on it for it to actually be something that is going to give you accurate information. When you go to those sources, which you should, say you pull up a Natural History Museum article and it tells you that it's talking about Naledi And it tells you that Lee Berger has stated this about Naledi. And it quotes Lee Berger, and at the bottom it has a little bibliography, and it tells you this article is Lee Berger's article. It gives the title of the article and it puts Lee Berger's name in it, right? So you want to click on that article and you want to go to that article. When you're looking at this article, you want to make sure that within this article that Lee has given you data. So if I'm going to tell you that I carbon 14 dated something, I'm going to tell you that I used this technique of carbon 14 dating, because all of them are different techniques of carbon 14 dating, that I uploaded that technique of carbon 14 dating into this program and it spit out this number. And then I took that number and uploaded it into, and I can't remember what they call it, but basically it kind of confirms your dating, and it also like it changes it, like it gives it a mean date. That's what it is, the mean dating. And so I'm going to take that and I'm going to upload it into the mean date, and the mean date is going to give me. So when Lee Berger is telling you that I carbon 14 dated this, he's going to say I carbon 14 dated it using this. It gave me this number. I uploaded that number into this program, which gave me this number. And I uploaded that number into this program, which gave me this number. You're not going to understand the programs. You're not going to understand the numbers. You want to take that and see that they're actually doing the work, but don't really double down on trying to understand what each of those different programs mean, right? So when you're doing that, it can be extremely hard to wade through many of these technical articles and really figure out what's going on. I will skip all the chunks that have all of the different huge numbers of different things in them and read the conclusion. Then I'll go back into the article and see where they're doubling down on that conclusion, right? Just so that I can make sure that I understand fully. You can start with, they'll start at the top. They'll give you their thesis of the article. They'll give you what they're laying out in the article. Then they lay out it in the article and then give you a conclusion at the end. So you can read the thesis and read the conclusion and then go back and pick through the article. You want to look at the numbers and retain some of the numbers, but don't try and, strontium isotope dating states that it's this, and then this dating in this technique, and then this, because you're going to get lost in it. I get lost in it, right? So it's extremely hard to, unless numbers are your bag, it can be extremely hard. Make sure though that the articles that you're looking at have a lot of good sources on them, or at least a few decent sources on them, or a few good sources on them. It is okay to take the article from the Natural History Museum that Lee Berger has contributed to and read that article for the understanding, and then go to Lee Berger's article to get the double down of what those understandings mean. It might change your perception on the article sometimes, but the combination of the two will give you a better understanding of what's trying to be said in that text if you don't have a lot of the big jargon. It's hard for those of us with extended degrees. I have had an extremely verbose, broad vocabulary since I was 5. Like I started learning to read in archaeological texts. I read at a high school level before I was in middle school. Like I can understand and comprehend. It's really, really high, and I can't understand and comprehend hardly at all. And so it's very difficult. When we're looking at that, you definitely want to make sure that you're getting some decent sources, but you also want to make sure that you're doing your own research on it. And you can go to places like Google Scholar and different places. You have to kind of dig through to find articles that you can actually access sometimes. We are going to move on though, and we're going to go into a couple of the other things here. So when we're looking at really, I think we've gone over most of the list, but we're going to go ahead and touch on Denny and Denny herself, the picture behind me. So Denny herself was 13 years old when she died, to our knowledge. We have a 2-3 inch piece of thigh bone of Denny. It is one of the larger pieces that we have from Denisova Cave. And we can tell from this thigh bone her age at 13, that her biological sex was female. And then we can also tell that her father was a Denisova and her mother was a Neanderthal. This is because we're seeing a Denisova mitochondrial DNA in her, and we're seeing a Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA within her. And it also gives us the trace in the way that you can look at the whole genome of it. Um, we know that at this time, this is 90,000 years ago, that Denisovians and Neanderthals are all living together in this cave. At this point in time, we're not really seeing that sapien is a part of this group, but we are seeing that Denisova and Neanderthal are in this space. For me, this is one of those important things. She is the only DNA that we have that shows a direct descendant of two different species. Um, so lifespan can be very hard in ancient hominins. And the reasoning is because we can tell you the age of the oldest that we have found, but that doesn't mean that there's not others that, lived longer, right? So Neanderthals, the oldest that we have found are roughly 50. That does not mean that people weren't living to 60 or 70. It just means that we haven't found finds of people living to 60 or 70. We have like under 20 Neanderthal finds. It is picking up after we're doing the DNA testing from Denisova Cave. We're getting more information, right? And so that might give us a little bit better. But to our knowledge, currently the oldest that we have found is 50 years old. And so you can think probably 60 is your lifespan at this time, your top end, like you've really been taken care of and you're living pretty long here. Um, we haven't found, I think, enough of Denisova to give us a good range, right? We're seeing that with Denisova that we've got like 10 finds from Denisova at this point of time. And I haven't heard of who our oldest is with Denisova. With the ghost species, we haven't found any of them, so we don't know. And Lieberger is the person who runs the Naledi find, and he hasn't put out an oldest age on the Naledi find yet. Uh, again, Luzon Zensus is so new; it's only a couple years old, and we don't have a whole lot of information out public on it yet. So I do not know if they have any range on that. And I actually haven't seen a range scale on the Florensis either. So it might not be that Florensis, because we're not getting DNA from Florensis, it's going to be harder to judge. And also, so to be able to tell age comes from, we have to kind of understand, we have to get some understanding of the bone age, right? So that is a little bit harder, I think, with Florensis as well. I'm not sure if we've actually put out an age. I have not seen an age range on Florensis myself. Um, which one, Donnan? And I'll answer it, but I'm not exactly sure which one I was going over at the point of time when you asked that question because my thinking leg. So for the Neanderthals, the oldest we have is about 50. So we can think probably the newest find, the Naledi newest find, or Luzon Zensus, which is the newest hominin find, or so there's a Cerruti Macedon find that is in San Diego, California, that pushes back the dating here in Turtle Island of hominin presence 100 to 130,000 years. Naledi. Naledi is in the Rising Star Caves are the Naledi Caves in South Africa. That is, yeah, and that's the correct spelling, Luna. Naledi is intriguing to me. And Naledi is intriguing to me. They're probably going to become my favorite. Neanderthal has been my favorite for a long time. Naledi is probably going to become my favorite just because of the advancement that we see, right? Just how advanced that they are as a species, how many things that we see in them that we didn't know existed before us, right? And so those are a really cool one. But Denny is the only one that we see that we have. So we have two other possible hybrid children. We have one where we see a jawbone, and I think it's like 100,000 years old, and we think that it might be a cross between Neanderthal and sapien, but it's just a jawbone. And the reason that we think it might be a cross between Neanderthal and sapien is because it has the Neanderthal chin, but Neanderthals have a gape between their back tooth and their mandible, and this does not have the gape. So we don't have the gape. We're the only species that doesn't have the gape. This is called a derived feature. It is a feature that only a singular species has. It can only be attributed to that species. And so this jawbone looks like it's part Neanderthal and part sapien. Denny, they only found her thigh bone. We've got like a 2-3 inch piece of her thigh bone. And then we have one other that is a more recent one. Let me pull up my hybrid children thing because I have there is a link on my website that has different hybrid children on it. It is underneath the bibliographies and no, it's underneath this week and it says hybrid children. And so we have the Lapido child and the Lapido child. Let me see. Let me double check that the Lapido child is the one that I wasn't talking about. Okay, no. The Lapido child is another one that we think might be half Neanderthal and half sapien. It is a 4-year-old child in Iberia. And it is, well, this one has a chin of a modern human. We are the only one that has the bump on our chin. This is we call it the mental eminence, and it's why we have our name of sapien, which means wise. So we're the only one that has this. The Lapido child has the mental eminence, but has the gape between the back tooth and the jaw that we don't see, or the mandible that we don't see here. And it has the build of a Neanderthal, but it has the lower arms of a modern human. Meaning that their lower arms are probably not, they're probably a little bit longer than the Neanderthal would have been. Neanderthals are a little bit shorter and a little bit stockier. Not necessarily a series. We've talked about a few of these things before. The YouTube channel that I have has past lives on it. So you can go to the YouTube channel that I have and you can go through some of the past lives to get some more of the information on it. I try and name most of them, but not all of them. And then on the website itself, there are little bibliographies, little pieces where you can go and get different articles and access different articles to get more information. Most of the articles are not like scientific articles, right? Most of the articles on the website are, coming from, different actual news centers. And this is because it's easier for you to access them because most things are a little bit harder for people to access. So like I've got one from ukessays.com, right? But you can read that without having to pay. Whereas if I were to grab it from a scholar site, it might be something you have to pay. You have to sign in to get to. I might have a sign in, and if I give it to you, you don't have that sign in. So I do make sure that they're articles that can be easily accessed. And then they usually have, and I can't say all because I haven't gone through every one of them recently. I have at some point, but sometimes I miss things, right? So when you're looking at them, you should be able to scroll to the bottom and get a little bit of a bibliography on the bottom. And when you get the little bit of the bibliography on the bottom, you should be able to click on different links in that bibliography that will take you to actual journal articles and what was accessed by that website or by that that organization to create that article. But I do try and go over a few different things. And I do try and make sure that all of them are backed up on YouTube. I do have an old YouTube channel as well. It's my private channel. And I didn't want to dox myself. Like that's the email address associated with everything else. And so it is, if you're not finding the article you want on there, message me and I will make sure that you can get to the access to the other YouTube and it'll show you that one too. Oh, no worry. You're absolutely welcome. Welcome. Um, the website, the inwiddaord.com, though, right there, it does link to the YouTube. It links to publications that I've done, and it links to different areas so that you can find different information. Um, I'm going to go. I didn't want to be on for too long today because I'm trying to make sure I've got other stuff going, but I wanted to come on a little bit this evening. I will be back on Sunday and Monday, and then I will probably be gone for the rest of the week because I have we're going out of town. So much love to everybody. Remember, please, and we didn't touch on it as much today, but we try and touch on it typically. Our species has 5 life stages from neonate to adult. We are the only species, not even Neanderthal, had 5 life stages from neonate to adult. Those 5 life stages mean that we must have a community to nurture our children to adulthood. Not only must we have a community to nurture our children to adulthood, but we must have a community to birth our children. We have something called mandatory midwife childbirth. Neanderthal is the only other species that's had this, and this is because of the size and the shape of our skull comparatively to the pelvic outlet of our females as they're giving birth. Our children have to be turned as they're birthing. They have to come out kind of sideways for their skull and then come out facing forward for their shoulders. And so we um, must have communities to subsist. We are also extremely creative as a species. We are the only species to adapt our adaptations currently. Humans, so Homo species, have adapted their adaptations in the past, but we are the currently Homo species around, right? Um, and this indicates that we are an extremely creative species. We are extremely curious species. So innately, we must nurture. Innately, we must have community. And innately, we are creative. We are taught today that innately we're evil and we have to fight that evil. This is false. We are taught today that innately some of us are weaker than others. This is also false. When we think that we are something innately, then we don't change it because you can't change what I am. I'm innately that. That's just it, right? And so it's very important to know that innately we are nurturing and innately we are communal and innately we are curious. And that if we can remember that about ourselves, then we can understand why we're all so depressed because we're living in this extremely disconnected, denurturing society. And we can understand how to get back to it, right? And understand the changes that need to be made within all of us to get us back there. So I want to leave you with leave you all with that we are innately nurturing, we are innately communal, and we are innately curious. That we must have each other and give each other love and give each other community and give each other nurture and embrace our curiosity to be healthy as a species. And so, if you are depressed and exhausted and overwhelmed in this disconnected society, it is right. If you are not depressed and overwhelmed and feeling lonely and feeling like something is wrong, then you might want to see a psychiatrist because there might actually be something wrong, right? Um, because you've disconnected and dissociated. So, as you move forward, hold grace in your heart for yourself that you are feeling the effects of a traumatized existence that is traumatizing in the fact that it is disconnecting. It is traumatizing in the fact that we have lost community. And it is traumatizing in the fact that we do not nurture. In fact, we seem to have turned nurture into an evil, right? Hold grace for yourself and realize that the depression that you suffer and the hurt and the loneliness and all of those things that you're feeling are part of the change, part of being aware enough to create the change. And therefore, you are necessary. That it is those feelings within you that makes you the most necessary because we need that to be able to affect the change in our society, in our globe, to get back to where we need to be. So please remember to hold grace for the trauma that you live in and the feelings that that engenders within you, and that you're not fucked up because of it. You would, in fact, be fucked up if you didn't feel those things, because we are innately nurturing and we are innately communal. And that is all of us, not just men, not just women, not just mixed genders. That is all of us. We are all needed to nurture a child. A child in the start of our species needed 30 people to nurture it from neonate to adult, right? And it didn't need 30 women to nurture it from neonate to adult. It needed 30 people to nurture it from neonate to adult. So remember that that nurture and that community and that sadness within you should be met with grace, because you are a part of the change and you are needed in that change. Much love to everybody. Again, I will be back on Sunday. I'll see you guys then. Bye. Bye, YouTube. Much love, and I will see you on Sunday.